Okay, it's 11:35, so let's get started. This is Documenting an Agile Team, How to Keep Up. I am Alana Burke. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at Amazy.io doing documentation, training, developer advocacy, community management, and I probably wear a couple other hats that I'm not thinking about right now. Just a little about my background in regards to where I fall in terms of having this role and working in this DevOps company. I did about 10 years in web development, and I have a BS in information science and technology. And a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of working with an agile team. So I work at Amazy.io, which is a hosting company, and we have a product, Lagoon, which is our open source deployment tool. So while our primary focus is supporting our customers, we're also developing the product that helps us support them. So we have a small team, just about 30 people, including several folks that we share across our sister companies. We have about a dozen engineers, and I am the sole documentation writer. So I'm responsible for all of the documentation with a focus on our public-facing customer documentation. So let's dive in. Keeping up with the pace of an agile team. This is really tough, and it depends heavily on how your team works, but I've come up with some things that I think can translate to any situation. One of the first things is to invite yourself. Sometimes the docs writer can get excluded from the more technical team meetings. Invite yourself to them. You might find out that you don't need to be there all the time, but make that decision for yourself. The next thing is to be accessible. One of the ways that I've tried to make myself accessible as the team's documentation writer and to give our team dedicated places to discuss and look at our docs is just by making spaces for them inside of the resources that we already use. So we have a dedicated Slack channel that's just for documentation related discussion, which has been super helpful. I've also made a Jira board that shows every ticket that's tagged documentation. Or it also shows everything in our documentation epic. So that way, even if a ticket wasn't created by me and it's not assigned to me, I can still keep track of it if it's related to documentation. We also use a tool called Help that allows us to tag Slack posts with different emojis, and then that creates tickets in Jira. So I have an emoji that I can use on Slack tickets and other people can use that will create documentation tickets for me. So by using all of these things, it helps just lower the barrier to entry in terms of creating documentation or, putting documentation into our workflow. And also being flexible. I'm also juggling multiple projects, often juggling multiple projects at once. And what I plan to do for the week on Monday is often not what I wind up getting done on Friday. And as long as I'm doing what the team needs done and what helps our customers and our company, that's fine with me. I have a plan for what I want to get done, but there's also a lot of things moving and shifting at once. And it's important not to be too rigid in your planning that you can't adapt. And how your team works from tickets to delivery can make this easier on you. If your project manager writes good user stories, those stories can inform what you need to write and document, along with what the engineers need to build. So have a process and make that process work for you. Sprints can also be your friend. Sometimes I feel really overwhelmed by how much there is to document. I think you could work at any company for a decade and still find things that you want to document. So following a sprint can help to prioritize and give you discrete chunks of work to tackle. How to be aware of changes before they happen. So part of keeping up is being aware of major changes to your code base before they happen. So ideally, some of the tips that we've just gone over will help keep you in the loop, but it won't always. So ideally, we can do more. The first tip here is to monitor everything. First, keep an eye on pull requests and instruct that any pull requests changing documentation or making additions to documentation be assigned to you or your docs team. But that relies on humans to tell you what they're doing, and that's not always going to be reliable. So far, the best way that I've found to stay on top of things is attending product team meeting stand-ups to be aware of current and incoming changes, having regular calls with the product owner. In my case, the product owner is also my direct manager, so this is easy for me. We already have a lot of one-on-ones. Skimming relevant Slack channels. These may be channels that you don't actively participate in, but only sort of lurk in. Give yourself permission to participate in them too. You know, if engineers are discussing a major change that you've never heard about, say, hey, when is that scheduled to roll out? Do we have a ticket for that? Are there docs for that? Find out. There is sort of this historical idea of tension between doc teams and engineering teams. And a huge part of tearing down that divide, to me, is remembering that we're all peers on the same team, working towards the same goal. And when I first started, I always felt like I was being a jerk when I was saying, like, hey, do we have docs for that? Are there docs for that? Can I write docs for that? Can we talk about docs for that? But I realized that our team wants there to be docs for that. We just have to figure out how to make it happen. So the main idea here is to find out where changes are being talked about and for you to be there. You know, like I said, sometimes I feel like a broken record, but I'm always popping up in meetings and in Slack to say, hey, do we need docs for that? Has that been documented? Do you need me to write that up? But if it exists, it should be documented. And so there I am talking about it and asking. This next one is something that I've run into recently. And it was actually one of the things that helped spur me to write this talk. Being diplomatic when breaking changes are introduced. So sometimes you're going to miss things. And some things will be merged when you're away or asleep or sick on vacation, or you'll just be merrily working away and suddenly you'll notice that things aren't working. So what do you do? So a couple of things happened recently that caused some links and media in our documentation to break. And my initial instinct was, of course, to be annoyed because someone had broken all my work. But I kept my cool while we figured out what happened. So the first incident was that we changed our default branch from master to main. And I knew that this was happening, but I didn't know when the button was going to be pressed. Unfortunately, when this happened, a lot of links broke, and I had no idea it had happened. And after fixing it, I resolved to implement measures to keep that from happening again. At about the same time, a handful of YouTube videos that I'd created for our docs broke. Our marketing team handles those, and it turned out they had updated the intros and outros, but instead of replacing the same video, they had deleted the old ones from YouTube and uploaded new ones, making new URLs. And I was really not happy about this, especially as those videos had been used and shared in various places like social media already. But I knew that our marketing team was just trying to make us look good, so I talked and explained why the URLs should need to stay the same and requested that any other changes to documentation-related content get run by me first. It can be really hard not to be irritated when things break and it makes you look bad. Documentation is my domain at our company. I own it. I'm responsible for it. When things are out of my control, I don't like it. But I know that at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal. So when breaking changes are introduced, the first thing to do, if you're anything like me, is wait until you're not annoyed. Just take a minute. If you know that you can be a little hot-headed or snippy, don't talk about it right away, especially if you work remotely. Walk around the block, have a snack, then come back and calmly discuss it. If you're remote, It can be helpful to hop on a video chat. Text can be hard, especially if you're tense. It can be easier to talk it out in person and make sure that you don't accidentally say something that's taken in a way you didn't mean. So for me, this meant discussing it in a video call and making sure that we worked everything out, both in terms of not merging things that broke all of my documentation and not updating marketing things without letting me know when they affected my documentation. I should stop saying my documentation, but I have a lot of ownership feelings about it. Technical solutions to help keep track of changes and problems in your docs. I've said this a few times. Slack or whatever chat your company uses. Keep an eye on channels where updates are discussed. Lurk in engineering channels, even if you're not active in them. 2, issue tracking. Subscribe to issues for updates. Use your issue tracking software to keep an eye on all things documentation related. Set up a board that helps you see what's going on. Use your existing tools. Have a dedicated channel in your Slack or your chat client to discuss docs. And in your version control, Git or whatever you use, watch repositories and PRs, set up notifications so that you can see what's going on. This way you won't be blindsided if something comes through. The main idea here is to find the technical spaces where decisions are being made and where you can see what's going on and watch those spaces. Find the way that works best for you. Your workflow and your day is going to look different from your engineers and your project managers and your product owners, but where you overlap is where you can find out what's going on and stay on top of things. How to prioritize when you have to catch up to changes. So sometimes you're going to fall behind or find out that there have been code or functionality changes without documentation changes, but don't panic. Ask yourself a couple of questions and then proceed. What has been changed that customers need to know about right now? Is anything broken? Do they need to change any settings? If it's not an emergency, don't lose sleep over it. Update it as soon as you can. When it comes to documentation, the minimum viable product is what you're aiming to publish quickly. Get the steps the user needs to use your product. If they're going to need to install it, get those steps up. If there's a complex configuration needed in order to use it, get that information live quickly. The other details can wait. Our documentation we have set up pretty much as, here's a little info about it, here's how to install it, here's your basic info, and then here's your advanced info. So it's pretty much listed in order of priority. You need to know a little bit about what it is, or there's no point in, having this documentation because you wouldn't know whether or not you want to read it. Then you need to install the product, or in our case, there's a little bit of a difference between installation and using it, but that's details. And then, you're going to use the basic things first and then the advanced things. So in terms of the priority of writing it, it's installation, actually using the product, then the basic needs, and then the more advanced needs. Organizing your odds and ends. Don't make more work for yourself. So I write a lot. Internal docs, customer-facing docs, sets of docs delivered to customers directly. I'm always writing talk abstracts. I write them for myself. I write them for other people. I have notes, bits of docs, half-written docs, you name it. But it's all completely, perfectly organized on both Google Drive and anything in my computer. So if someone asks about something, I know exactly where it is. I also title everything, so there's no untitled documents floating around in my Google Drive. If it exists, I can find it and I can search for it. Everything is also shared with my coworkers. So if for any reason I should be out and maybe in the woods doing critter transport in in New England, like I so like to do, and away from signal and civilization, someone else can find everything that I have written. I never have to write something over that I know that I've written before. And those are my guinea pigs squeaking in the background, if you don't know. I never have to write something twice because I can't find it, because I can always find it. So again, don't make more work for yourself. Keep everything that you've written organized and searchable. And yes, we will have time for guinea pigs at the end. Writing excellent release notes. Finally, let's talk about this. Here we can make our process work for us. In an ideal world, you've been writing good PRs, so there's very little to write for your release notes, right? This is something that you can make even easier with templates. Template everything. Collecting info from your pull request should ideally give you what you need for your release notes. Collect this information and make it both useful and readable. If the information in your release notes isn't human readable or useful to your users, why do you bother with it? There's no need to write a clever paragraph, but do give your users actual information. What issues you've closed, security threats that you've addressed, bugs that you've fixed, new documentation that you've written. So a resource that I used very much while writing this talk is a really fantastic book called The Product is Docs. It's by Christopher Gales and the Splunk documentation team. I highly recommend it to anyone writing documentation in pretty much any context. I got a lot out of this book and will definitely be referring to it across my work in various ways. I know that was a lot of information in a pretty short talk. I originally wrote it for a slightly shorter conference, but I thought we still had a pretty short time in here, so I wanted to, I decided to just keep it the way it was. So if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them. I will look in the chat, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and pop them in the chat. Okay, we've got one from Sebastian. What is your framework for keeping everything categorized and searchable for you? So I just use Google Docs. So everything in my life is in Google Docs. It's in folders that are all nicely labeled, and you know, I just keep everything super organized. Nothing crazy there. Oh, there's a Q&A tab. Oh, that wasn't working last year. Cool. Good resource for templates. Oh, not off the top of my head, but I could put some together. Let me write that down. And I will share that on Twitter. Let's see. Sometimes new features or changes are driven by how the user story or documentation will end up being. Do you or someone else bring up documentation during planning? So I am not always involved, and this is another like invite yourself. I am not always involved in as many planning meetings as I would like to be, but I do always bring up documentation. If I am in any planning meeting, documentation gets brought up. So yes, I always bring up documentation. I know that my my boss, the product owner, brings up documentation. So it's another reason why I don't always feel like I have to go to those meetings, because I know that he will. I don't always trust that everybody else in the company will. But I do think it's important to make sure that when those meetings happen, that someone is there bringing up documentation. All right, people are coming in hard and fast here. Curious for recommendations for tools to automatically generate documentation pages, sites for a Drupal code base for a team that doesn't have budget for dedicated documentation staff. I forget the names of them off the top of my head. There are tools that generate documentation. I'm not a fan of automatically generated documentation. I don't think that it is worth its... I mean, commenting your code is great. You know, in the documentation that generates, it's helpful for developers in some ways, but And of course, I understand not having the budget for dedicated documentation staff, but I think it is worth trying to find the time for your engineers to do the actual documentation instead of generating it. I think it's that important. I mean, of course, it's my job. I think it's that important. But I just, the difference between human written documentation and machine generated documentation is just so vast. It's just a completely different thing. You know, there is no machine generated documentation that's going to like walk you through install steps or anything like that. But I will get the name of those tools. Hold on, I'm just writing down notes. Let's see. Do I keep internal and client-facing documentation separated? Yes. I don't do it. We as a company don't do a ton of client-facing documentation. We have a couple of like really big clients that wanted their own set of documentation. That's actually what I was initially brought on to do, was do this huge set of documentation for this one enormous client. So yes, we do keep that very separate. It's usually just sort of a version of our documentation for the client. So yes, it's very separate. Do documentation tasks block features from being released, or is it after? So no, they generally do not block it. It would be wonderful if nothing got released unless it was documented, but no, things generally get released whether or not they're documented, and the documentation happens either alongside or after. For our organization, we use SharePoint. Metadata is very important. How do you recommend the use of metadata for your documents? Michelle, can you clarify that? I'm not sure. I don't really know anything about SharePoint or sort of what you mean by metadata here. Let's see. How do you come up with a useful naming scheme that is both flexible and descriptive? What if there's more than one person responsible for documentation? A naming scheme for what? Can you clarify that, anonymous person? Let's see. Do you also handle writing and managing specifications, or are they different roles on your teams? Specifications for like technical specifications? No, I don't do that. We do have different roles. How do docs and spec roles interact? I'm trying to think. I mean, we sort of interact the way we don't really have anyone that I can think of whose like specific job is writing technical specifications. Like I said, we just have one product that we support, so we're not like constantly writing specifications or anything. So that's not like a huge role on our team. So I don't think I can speak to that specifically. Template for sprint retrospective meeting notes. I can find you one. Oh, says someone said, I'm not aware of a tagging feature in Google Docs. No, I just keep everything organized by, I probably said tagged, and I just meant everything is in folders that are all super organized and color coded and everything. No, they're not actually tagged. I think I just misused that word. Sorry. Sorry, Michelle, I don't think I can really speak to metadata. I've never had to interact with any of that. I'm sorry, I don't have any experience with that. Do you utilize acceptance criteria as a starting point for writing documentation over and above user stories? So it depends on what we are doing. For the client documentation, yes, there's always acceptance criteria. For our internal documentation or public documentation, not so much. I try to get there to be user stories or something, but a lot of times it's just write the documentation. Did I get everybody's? Hold on. Okay. Excuse me. Ooh, this is a good one. Do you have a recommendation for handling vocabulary? Do you have a dictionary of terms or similar? Yes. So I keep an ongoing living document that's it's a technical manual of style. So I address all sorts of things like grammar, how we're going to use different wording, what manual of style we're going to follow. So we are using the lovely AMA. And also things like, so we're a global company, and I had to make the decision that like all of our public documentation is going to be in American English because I'm American and I'm the documentation writer. But I also have a huge list of like, here are a bunch of technical words that we use that sometimes trip you up. Here's a list of words that are camel cased. Here's a bunch of words that aren't camel cased. You know, here's how we're going to use email, like without a dash. Here's how we're going to use this word. So it's really, really handy. And I highly suggest that you start some kind of document like that and share it with your company, because I found that it's really useful. I've also started a huge glossary that I share at our company of like every single technical or marketing or whatever kind of term or abbreviation that ever comes up. Everything from the word Kubernetes to Git to anything. So anyone who sort of comes into our company can, you know, read that, reference that. It's just a gigantic spreadsheet, and it starts, you know, it has like a definition of the word, links to the words, where we use them, you know, like how they're used within our company. And that's been something that's been really helpful for me. Like I kind of started it just for me, and then I shared it, and it's been really helpful. Do you use any tools to organize the documentation lifecycle? Not yet, but this is something that we are taking a look at. We're doing some reorganization of things and tools within our company. And so we're taking a look at all of our documentation holistically and not just our like specific public facing docs, and trying to see, you know, how everything is going to sort of live in its documentation ecosystem going forward. And, you know, what else needs to be documented and how it's going to be documented, and, you know, how everything is going to be processed going forward and who's going to be responsible for what. So we do not yet have those tools, but they're going to happen. And that kind of is with the next question. Do you have a process for periodically reviewing all extant documentation for fixing outdated information? Currently, I am so in the documentation every day that anything outdated is just, you know, it's in front of my eyes all the time, and we're moving really fast and we're changing lots of things. So at the moment, it's not a huge concern because we're just constantly working and changing and updating. But again, we're currently working to make some official policies of, you know, this is how often we review this. This is, you know, who's going to be responsible for this part. And this is when we're going to, you know, make sure everything is up to date and how often we do that. Oh, that was a lot of questions. I am going to snag a guinea pig while you guys are taking a break from questions. This one is Nora. She's my friendliest and the easiest to nab. And yes, I will share the slides. I hope this is helpful to everyone. You can follow me on Twitter at aberg626, which is also my DrupalCon, or sorry, Drupal.org username. You can also find me on Drupal Slack at Alana Burke. I will find some more answers to some of these questions and share them on Twitter when I get a chance. I will also share the my slides. Are there any other questions? We still have some time. Do guinea pigs get along with cats? Mine are fine. Guinea pigs are prey animals, so they can get a little nervous, but my cats do not have any prey drive left whatsoever because I've been bringing home animals for 15 years. So my guinea pigs are fine with the cats and with the dog. The dog just thinks she's a nanny to everything. And if you want to see more animals, on Friday at 3:30, Amaze.io is going to be having, I don't think we've posted a link anywhere, but we will be having a little pet session where everyone can come and share their pets. So keep an eye out for, that'll be shared. I'll definitely be sharing it on my Twitter when we have the link. And if you want to find out a little bit more about the history of diversity and inclusion in Drupal, Ellie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe tonight we are having the rescheduled Hidden Histories of the Drupal community session. Yes, and Ellie just dropped the link in the chat. Oh, sorry, our session ended. All right, thanks everyone.